Welcome to the Path Podcast, where we will travel the lives of some bold women, from dreams to detours to destiny. She did not choose this path chose her. This is the Path Podcast.
Hey, welcome back, everyone, to season 2 of the Path Podcast. It is you here with me, your sister, Arlene, your motivator, your confidence builder, the one who believes that purpose is bigger than obstacles. Any obstacle that you're facing today, is it impossible for me to believe that I want every woman healed and free? It's not impossible when you believe. It's just doing the work. It's making the time and doing the work to be intentional about your healing today. I can't wait to get into who my guest is today, my very first guest of season 2. I think I'm going to have to bring her back to do more shows with me, live shows, because this is a topic that I read something she said, where she said, while so many topics in our world right now divide us, grief is the one that unites us. So that is our topic today. We're talking grief and trauma. And that is such a true statement in where we are today. Something every human being has experienced is grief. And when I read and connected and saw this person's, and I'm going to share her name in a second, when I saw her page on Instagram, I knew I had to have her on the show. I'm that one who looks and it seemed like I feel a connection with a person, and because of the work she's doing. We know there are different things we can grieve. We grieve divorce, we grieve the loss of a job, we grieve friendships ending and relationships ending. So we're talking today mostly about grieving the loss of a loved one. And what is grief? I know she can explain better than me, but I still wanted to look up the definition for everyone, or just what some people say. It's a natural response to loss. It's the emotional suffering we feel when something or someone we love is taken away. I can truly understand that from my story. Whatever type of loss you're feeling today, I think this topic will help you and my guest. And who is my guest? Is none other than Lanise Shortell. Who is Lanise? I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, but she can tell us the rest. Lanise has served Atlanta, Georgia as a pediatric and perinatal hospice nurse for nearly 2 decades. She is a grief advocate and speaks domestically and internationally on the importance of grief, acknowledgement, and expression for global well-being. She is honored to train Emory University Hospice and Palliative Care Fellows on the unique emotional landscapes of caring for children at end of life outside of the hospital walls. That is one of the things that drew me so to her. There is more she said, but that's the part I'm going to ask her to share. As we welcome in my first guest of 2022, Lanise Shortell. Welcome, Lanise. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so grateful to be here. And thank you again for being an advocate for grievers and just opening up dialogue around this conversation as your first opening podcast of the year.
No, thank you. And everyone, I want to let you know, some of the things we're going to talk about is, how to cope with grief, how to learn to grieve, taking care of yourself as you grieve, exploring additional resilience tools I've heard you talk about, integrating cognitive and somatic therapies,
Right.
relating to the body, right? And then something I read too, how children grieve. Grief is different from adults, in which I would understand that can be the case. Lanise, let me first, the one thing I like to ask sometimes is, tell me about the younger Lanise. I know I was going to read this from your bio, but I want to first ask you, tell me about the younger Lanise, and then how you got into the work you're doing today.
So that's a good question, because we all find our path, and that's what I love about this podcast. We find our path oftentimes through our deepest injury.
Yes.
And so that's how my life and grief began to be. I was 4 years old, and just like every 4-year-old, I was running around with my family. We woke up one morning and we're intact.
Mhm.
And at the end of that day, there was a tragic car accident, and I lost my parents and my little brother that day. My sister and I do have an older sister. She was 9 at the time. I was 4. And, our life really did change on a dime in a moment. And because of that, I was, my grandparents were the parenting figures that became the parenting figures in my life. And what was really beautiful and kind was that they supported me in my grief from that 4-year-old all the way up. So I kind of went through all those developmental stages of grief that children do. It's very unique. It can look very jagged, but they just allowed me to do it. I mean, my traumatic loss occurred in the dark ages of grief, where there wasn't a lot of talking around it. We are slowly turning that corner now. We're talking more and more about it. But for me, the act of grieving and mourning is something that is life-saving, and it's needed. And even as much as we're talking about it now, and there's a lot of quote unquote people or therapists on Instagram, like putting up these little pictures, we still need to talk about it. We have to go back down to talking about it, being real about it, and not just getting your emotional support through social media, pictures. We're kind of shutting down grief in another way now that everything is back on, social media since COVID happened. We don't have a lot of co-regulation with other human beings, like people that can hold your hand, can give you a hug. The rituals around, funerals and getting together have been disrupted. So for me, I think COVID is going to really spike a lot of the maladaptive coping mechanisms that are common in grief. So I didn't mean to get off on a tangent there. So the 4-year-old, the 4-year-old in me, that's kind of what has driven the bus for the work that I do and that I have done for almost 20 years. And so I believe in purpose in life. I believe in you really do tend to stay along the pathway of where your heart and spirit is and where they are. And so I will be doing this work in some form, probably the rest of my life. So yeah.
Yes. Let me tell you, thank you for sharing that. And my heart goes out to you having to lose your family, you besides your sister, thank God, in such a tragic way. And so who better would understand such a, even though you were so young, but it's amazing how the path in life takes you and where you are today and the work you're doing today. And that's why they always say sometimes we don't understand why we go through what we go through, but it all works together. And we can't understand it sometimes. But you said so much that I want to touch on because I can relate. I lost my mother at 12, and so I understand that part of it. I love the part where you said that social media, you're trying to change just not posting words and about grief, which is a wonderful thing that people do it, but that connection and that is a lot of the work it looks like you're doing. And we want to talk about that a little bit later. But let me go back to the 4-year-old. Did you understand it at the time?
Well, developmentally around that age, most children are in that magical thinking phase where you don't realize that life actually, when you have a death, that the person doesn't come back. Exactly. 4-year-olds, I mean, there's developmental milestones from infancy all the way through 18 and 19. And developmentally, I was kind of stuck in that magical thinking. And I remember having dreams, shortly after the accident of my mom, just like rope coming down from heaven and her climbing down from heaven, coming to tell me that she was okay. And then climbing back up into heaven. I mean, that's kind of the thought process of a child. And, with each developmental stage, you kind of get the deeper meaning of it. And, we could do a whole podcast on adverse childhood experiences, which is it's a medical kind of exploration of children when they lose and have a lot of grief and trauma in their life, like what can happen if you don't progress through these concepts.
Of course.
But yeah, so the 4-year-old grew up with me kind of like in that magical thinking. And then, as I got older, the realization of that loss kind of hit a little bit deeper. And really was after I had, like when I had my first child, my son, I think it hit me the hardest. I think that loss of that mother, even though, like I said, I had my grandparents were my parent figures. I'm so grateful that they were there,
Yes.
but not having that mom there, it kind of it punches you a little bit deeper in the gut. So, child loss is really complicated. There's a whole lot that we can talk about there, and there's professionals around the world that they really devote their lives to this. So
Yes.
thanks for honoring that, because oftentimes we forget about the kids that are grieving.
Oh my goodness, yes. And so I understand what you're saying, because the one thing I read, you said you don't remember what life was like without traumatic loss. Most
Right.
of your journey was seeking resources and validating other people and bringing the importance of grief and advocacy to light. And I want to thank you for truly trying to bring this topic that every human being has experienced. Like you said, it unites us, to light. And I can't go on and on. There's so many shows I would want to do with you, as like you said. And you said people think if you talk about death, you bring it on to you. And that is why I think sometimes there's a fear how we talk about death and how we deal with it. And because people have that fear, and grief is heavier when you have regret. Those are a lot of the things I've heard you said around this whole topic, because in understanding that. So tell me then, you always knew you wanted to get into being a registered nurse, then going into the field you're in, or how did you fall into this?
Yeah, I think I think it was my grandmother had always, she stayed at home her entire life. And my grandparents were, as I was going through high school, they were trying to guide me, and they're like, you just need a job like a teacher or a nurse. They're very family friendly. Yes. And so I just kind of I decided that's what I was going to do. And my path took, right out of nursing. I was in Columbia, South Carolina, I went to school there. And when I graduated, I went straight into a pediatric hospice hospital. It was Richland Memorial at the time. And we had a floor that we had experience where there was the intensive care floor, there was a bone marrow transplant floor, and there was like the med surg floor. And I just was never afraid of going into the space where death was occurring. I wasn't afraid of it because like I shared with you, I mean, I don't know life outside of loss. I don't know, that's all I've ever known. So I wasn't really afraid of it, where some of my other coworkers, and not to say this is good or bad, they just didn't have the comfort with it. And so I was drawn to that. I was drawn to, being able to talk to families, being able to say, it's okay to be mad. It's okay to be pissed off at God. It's okay. You cannot suppress any of these emotions that are coming up. Essentially, just when I was able to have interactions with families, with children that were at end of life, just reframing what strength looks like. Let's just reframe that. People think that strength means you don't cry, you don't talk about it, you move on. And that's not healthy strength. That's not the kind of strength that's going to enhance your life quality. And so that's kind of where it started. And from there, my family moved to Atlanta, and I was here doing IV, home care for kids that had really complicated medical conditions. And a position opened up in pediatric hospice, and I've been here, and I love it. I feel like a Plinko chip, like from The Price is Right. If you know how it starts on one place, but it ends up like hitting the $1 million jackpot. Yes. I just feel like this role, this place in my life that God really carved it out for me, and I'm very honored. And I don't take a day for granted. And it has been amazing to me.
And so in the work,
the people that I get to meet, the
family. Of course. And so can you tell us a little bit about sometimes that those first, when you're meeting the families, and some of the work you're doing when you're helping, and what you're doing? So are parents coming, you're dealing with parents who are hearing that they may lose? Let me ask.
Yes. So our team, because no one person can do this work alone. Okay. It's called an interdisciplinary team for a reason, because this is really heavy and you need a team to hold it up. So we're called in when a child has been diagnosed with a condition, either prenatally or, after birth, and at any age all the way up to like 21 here. I mean, the United States, pediatrics is 21 and younger, that has a life-limiting illness. And so we come in, sadly, like when families have been run over by a car of trauma or a truck with trauma, like, okay, the life that I once envisioned isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm scared. I'm angry. I don't know what to do. And oftentimes, with the oncology kids that we take care of, or those with chronic health conditions where that little tipping point goes over to terminal, from chronic to terminal, we see mothers and fathers that have really shouldered a lot of grief and trauma for a long time, because, grief begins, especially in pediatric hospice or even in adult hospice, grief begins when that diagnosis is made that the condition is terminal. If we wait to really talk about loss until after the loved one dies, we're way behind the eight ball. We're not helping grievers. We are not being advocates of those in pain. So that is what we believe, and especially in pediatric hospice, is that grief begins the moment that diagnosis is given to you. And we start arming our families with resources at that moment. Because if we waited, it could be literally between life and death. And we can talk more about that. But grief, unexpressed, unsupported, can lead to very poor coping mechanisms. And so we take this job very, very seriously.
Of course.
When it comes to that first initial grief assessment.
I love what you said, that it starts, grief starts with that first diagnosis.
Right.
And everything you're saying can relate to everything in our lives again, the things that we grieve. You hearing the marriage is ending, and everything starts then. And everybody should truly be intentional about starting, wishing everyone could have that help, like, the parents and the people you're dealing with in the hospitals. That's a wonderful thing. Is that something that is offered around the world equally? Well, I think I know the answer, sadly, but I'm going to let you tell me.
Sadly, pediatric hospice is not something that's very well staffed and funded globally. I mean, here in the United States, we are starting to build that. We're starting to get more resources, but still, like even in Metro Atlanta, guys, within the perimeter of Atlanta, and I think there's 8 million people, we have one complete pediatric hospice to cover all of that. So there's still a lot to be learned. We do things very differently. And I often tell my friends that work in grown-up hospice is that I wish that all the grown-ups could get the care and attention and really the bereavement work that that pediatric hospice provides, because it definitely is it's a unique path.
Yes. Wow. Let me ask you, so when you're dealing with the parents, if they have little ones that are other siblings, you dealing with the whole family? Are you doing one that's separate between the parents and the children as well?
It's family centered. It's hospice as a whole, but especially pediatric hospice is family centered. When we first meet that family, we bring in resources. We do what we call a bereavement assessment, like who are the people that are in this family? And it doesn't necessarily have to be blood related people.
Exactly.
It could be a godmother, it could be a neighbor, it could be a best friend. Yes, I mean, a family is what that mother and father decide that's a family for that child. No matter how old they are. And so one of the wonderful things that we have in Atlanta is we've got so many schools and like child life specialists, and they intern with us. And we have PhD counselors that volunteer to come in to kind of help with our families and the structures and helping with children. And, even grownups deal with grief around what is to come. And you'll notice, like, when in grief, oftentimes, if you're familiar with it, there is something that the big world outside of our little function calls anticipatory grief.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've ever heard about it. I don't believe in anticipatory grief. So I believe that grief happens when it happens. And like especially in hospices, whether you're pediatric or grown up, anticipatory grief is when you're worried about the person like dying. Well, you already know they're going to die. You already know that that's going to happen. You already know the marriage is going to fail. You already know that your loved one has a disease that is going to progress to end of life. And that's when grief happens. That's when grief happens.
So
it just comes in different ways. Yeah.
I can so understand that. Even though I know I shared with you, I lost my best friend in 2008. And now we were always, when she got her diagnosis, we were always believing, definitely for a different outcome. But you still can lose. Grieve because it was my best friend. She's such a lively person, full of life. And to see the person after the time and it progressed, it was hard. I made changes in my life just based off of this, going through that with her, because I was at her house every day, around her every day. And it made me, some Sundays when I wanted to take a nap, I stopped taking naps. And I'm like, I felt like I had to be doing something. And it even allowed me to want to change how when I wake up every day, I wake up with, it's life. I have life and I have breath in my body and I have health. I'm just thankful. So I need to be doing something and sharing something and just be. And, and it really changes a person. So tell me about a lot of the, some of the work you do, that if it's with the parents or outside of the parents, with helping people grieve and talking more about that and all you're doing.
So that's a big topic. Let me try to, so what we do, so in this role of pediatric hospice, it's unique in that for peds hospice, we follow our families for 2 years after the loss of a child, because we realize that we consider high risk grievers. These are high risk human beings that have had a lot of stress and trauma and grief, and this has been chronic. Typically by the time these families come to us. And so we start building that relationship of trust the minute that we meet with the families. And then we carry that trust with us through the end of the child's life and then into the bereavement part. And the bereavement part is essentially recognizing that grief is trauma. Trauma is on the big scene now, like trauma this, trauma that. Grief at a loss of a significant relationship is traumatic, and we treat it as such. So that's where we start. We also look at ways to bring in resources that are validating to that particular person or family. One of the beautiful things that I love about Atlanta is we serve the most spiritually and culturally diverse square mile in our country, in Clarkston, Georgia. So we have kids from all over the world that we serve in this area. And so we have to build resilience recipes for people of different faiths, of different cultures. And it is absolutely beautiful to see. Like you had said, I had spoken in the interview that you listened, that we have so many things in this world that divide us, but grief does it unites us more than anything. And whether it means a family from Thailand, whether it means a family from Guatemala, Rwanda, Lithuania, all of these families around the world, they are united in the pain of loss and suffering. And it was interesting. I had a family about 2 weeks ago. We were talking to them. They're from Thailand, and they align with a Buddhist culture and religion. And we were just talking. I was getting to know kind of like where they go for support. And it was the most beautiful thing. And so the mom was like, when we welcome a child into this earth, when they're born, they're like, welcome to this world, to this life. This is the pathway to death. And that sounded a little dark at first, but she continued to explain, and she's like, we don't look at death as a constriction of the soul. We look at it as an expansion of the soul. So death actually expands the soul, and they see it as a beautiful process to do that. And that gave me, I'm telling you, the families that we serve, they put so much wealth of insight and soft skills and empathy into our team. Like that's a way that I've never heard death explained before, but it's also very beautiful if you think about it. Because, in our culture here in America, we're like, oh my goodness, death is the end, of our physical bodies. Now we all have different spiritual beliefs of that, but we see it as like, a making smaller of our soul, where this mom's like, no, we expand the soul, we make it more beautiful, we make it more full, it's still present. That was
beautiful. And it's amazing because you deal with this so much, and you've learned so much, and then you, like you say, you hear something like that, and I had to write that down. Death is an expansion to the soul. And even my daughter, she talks about being, I don't think she likes to talk about it. And I listened to another, someone else speaking on it, and they were talking about how we have to talk to our younger people, our kids, and they learn how we learn and what death is. And like you said, if we let them think it's just the end, that's how they're going to take it. And with the young lady from the family from Thailand sharing that, it really opens it up. Even though, in our faith, in my faith, we're talked about, it's beautiful, heaven, it's glorious, but we still see it as the end. We really do.
Right.
Because we
Right.
feel like this side on above ground, I'll say, is life only. But I love that. And that is a wonderful thing. So, and it's wonderful that you deal with, of course, you're going to deal with so many different people. So do you have to tailor it? Do you go in and how do you do it to make sure, because sometimes our cultures are different, and care is care to me.
There's a lot of training involved in it, a lot of training outside of like the regular nursing realm. There's certifications, there's international programs. And so we have had to immerse ourselves in that. But honestly, when it comes to religious alignment of anyone around the world, people just want to be listened to. Like even, I was raised as a Methodist. I was raised in the church there, and, Methodists are different, in South Carolina than they are in Atlanta. They're different from Atlanta than they are in LA. So you really just ask people, and it gives people a chance it gives grievers, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers, ability to say, this is what's important to me. And thank you for listening, because when I feel like I'm heard and that I'm, part of what I find important is put into this care, that I'm validated, and it diminishes trauma. When people feel heard, it's less traumatic. Now, it's not going to wipe out the trauma of the loss of a child, but when a soul feels heard, the body softens, and you don't have those physiological or psychological effects of trauma on the body.
I loved how you changing even my whole frame, even though I've spoken on how we have to get emotion out, how we have to express ourselves. That's how I just told my sister yesterday that I verbally speak my emotions. So that's how I get my emotions out. I talk my things out. Even through my divorce, I was angry. So I voiced my anger, and I didn't do it. I had to learn how to channel it, of course. And so my thing is, and I heard in one of your interviews too, about the place in Kennesaw, Georgia. We're in Georgia, everyone. But it's getting that anger out. That's
when you plate bust. But you're talking about the plate buster where you can throw plates around.
Exactly. It's a place, everyone, that you can go through just to express your emotions. Now it is healthy. There's a healthy way of expressing your emotions. You're not doing it at home, but, or like you said, it is a great way you have to get that emotion out. And I think sometimes we suppress it thinking we want everybody to think we're okay. And no, you're not okay. You're not okay. I wasn't okay losing my mother at 12. I didn't like losing my best friend, because even years later, after my daughter graduated high school and her son graduated, I would always say, wow, we were supposed to be traveling, best friends going around the world, just like, what's the movie? The movie with the two ladies. And it's just like, I felt like we were supposed to be in a car just driving around the world, just
Thelma and Louise. Thelma and Louise.
Also, we're supposed to be Thelma and Louise doing stuff. And, it's just, I had to grieve that fact that even with her, that person that I felt like knew me well, that she knew I didn't like, when we would, if we would go on a trip, I probably would have to get my own room because she snored so much that it irritated me. And and I could tell stories when we took the kids to Disney. I had to wear earplugs, and I'm like, oh my goodness. So she's gonna get me for talking about her, And but it's still those things you grieve, those moments, and getting those emotions out. And like you said, I love the fact. I'll go back to, like you said, everybody wants to feel heard, and everybody wants to feel validated, and it's building that connection with everyone. And so can you share any a lot of the work around the getting the emotions out, and the work you're doing, where you said it's integrating cognitive and somatic therapies?
Right. So, this is one of my it started with my own personal part of resilience, because
so this is a person, this is not outside of being a registered nurse, of course.
No, this is it. No, yeah. Well, it started like this. I started doing movement, and I'm careful when I say this because I know that sometimes there is a negative correlation around yoga. Some people think it's a religion. Some people, there's a lot of
Really?
differing opinions
Oh,
about it.
okay.
But for me, it was an incredible source of resiliency for my
Yes.
body, and for my mind. It allowed my spirit to be more flowing. And so I developed that. I mean, I started going to it as a personal, care technique for
Yes.
myself. And then as I noticed, and I kept reading as a nurse, the research around somatic work for people in trauma, I decided I was going to go and become a yoga instructor. So I got my advanced yoga teaching, really focusing on trauma and somatic work. And then I combine that with the bereavement care that we offer, and educate people on the benefits of body movement. And what you had mentioned in one of the interviews earlier, the research that is showing that is cutting edge, is that the best outcome for grievers, those suffering from trauma, is support cognitively. That's like support groups, talking to someone, sitting on a therapist's couch, talking to your best friend, to your spiritual advisor. Now that's good. But when it's combined with somatic work, that's body work, slow, intentional, even breathing, walking around the block, the yoga that I really prefer to practice and to teach is more of a yin, slow-based form, where you allow your body to release the restrictions and the constriction that grief keeps within the tissues. And there's a book out now, and I talk about this because it's probably one of the best resources that I give to families that we care for. It's Dr. Bissell Bandelkoff, and it's called The Body Keeps the Score. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list for, I can't even tell you how many weeks, but it gives you a very dense understanding of how the body does truly hold on to trauma, to grief, to unprocessed emotion. And with that, it causes inflammation. And with inflammation, as we know in the medical world, is the beginning of all disease. So if you can put that all together, if you have grief and trauma and you don't talk about it, and you suppress it into your body, your tissue becomes inflamed, and diseases can come from that. When I talk to the fellows that I teach at Emory, the fellows that I teach at Wellstar, which is a big hospital system here, and fellows are physicians that come in as a subspecialty to learn about pediatric hospice, I appeal to them whenever we're talking about the importance of getting somatic work involved with people that they care for and for themselves. Professional grief care is important as well. Because you and I know, and we know people that you can sit on a therapist's couch for 20 years and really never get any movement around your emotions. And what studies are showing is that when you integrate it with body work, that's when the true movement occurs. The most beautiful thing, and I know you mentioned earlier that you love the meaning of words, where emotion, like the Latin word of emotion is movere, meaning movement. Emotions are meant to move. If they don't move, that's when we start developing maladaptive coping mechanisms. This is when we become at risk for things like seeking substance abuse, lack of self-care in many, many, many ways. I mean, again, this could be a whole nother podcast episode. But human beings, human beings, if we don't want to address the emotions that we are carrying, you'll see it with alcoholism. You will see it with substance abuse. You will see it with cutting. You will see it with all of these things that we use to numb out emotion, when really it's just lack of grief expression.
So. Wonderful. And I've read, I love the book, The Body Keeps the Score. I want to say I've heard that. And I've heard where, and I was trying to look for it, where someone said, if you don't tell the body what to do, the body will tell. It's some ways that body would show it in different ways, which everything you just spoke about, it'll come out in different ways that we don't get these emotions out. And I did not know until you said it, and I heard that part in something else you spoke about, and just researching all of this, is that the Latin, you said it's the Latin word or the Greek word, emotion?
The Latin root, the root, the first meaning of the word emotion, that was, I think it was Greek and Latin, is movere, meaning movement.
And that makes sense.
Emotions are meant to move.
It does make sense. And just getting it out. And I didn't know that about what some people may think about yoga, but I can see how it can release and free whichever form of exercise, even if other people want to do some type of movement. But that
I love the fact that it's something that can be incorporated into grieving that I would have never thought about in that way. As I understand more of trying to move emotions out of us. The one thing I know I've heard that life should be like water, constantly flowing.
Mhm.
Because if we get stuck in a certain
Right.
position, it'll come out in still the different forms. We're not just going to live,
Right.
or we're going to drink, or we're going to pick something else up if we don't actively try to keep moving with the tides of life. Life is just a constant movement, and that's truly what it is. That's why I can understand integrating something, cognitive and somatic forms of therapy along with, like you said, sitting on a couch if you're talking to someone, which is a wonderful thing, because we have to get it out and feel
Mhm.
heard. And I'm a believer too, to feel like the answers are already within us, and it just helps.
Mm.
All of these things need to help bring it out and expressing those emotions. So tell me, are there other ways that you share that help us cope with grief, or to speak around grief and trauma?
I think that it is just, first of all, sitting still with yourself long enough to recognize the impact of grief on your
Hmm.
body. And I shared that I do yoga,
Yeah.
and it's a big part of this, my
Yes.
self-care. It's also part of the self-care that I open to the
Yes.
fellows, to the physicians in training, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, Lanise, this is wonderful." And it's also something, if you guys are interested in it, we do. We This is a whole nother topic too, but I host grief retreats with my partner in Atlanta. It's like a 3-day grief retreat, and it's on one of the most, well, actually Netflix called it one of the most amazing vacation spots in the world in Atlanta. So if you're ever interested in really doing a deep dive and looking at some of the cognitive and somatic benefits of grief
Hmm.
work in the body, you can let me know and I can give you information. I think we've got 5 retreats booked this year. We sold
Wonderful.
out all of our retreats last year because this is the time that people really want to do it in the age of
Of
COVID. So
course. And I was going to ask you to
yeah.
share. I want you to go back to, we're talking about the different ways to cope. Because you're talking
Yeah.
about the works, that the retreats. I looked at that
Mhm.
beautiful spot. Is that the?
Yes.
And if you don't mind, I'm gonna just jump in. Is that the place where Figgy was?
Yes, Figgy lives at the Atlanta Alpaca Treehouse, and Figgy is a special animal, guys. And when people hear us talk about this, they're like, "Lenise, I think you've lost your mind." I'm like, "No, no, I didn't. You've got to meet this. You've got to meet this llama."
Really?
So the Atlanta Alpaca Treehouse, guys,
Mhm.
it's a rescue wildlife habitat, and it's got a treehouse that has been featured in televisions around the world. But the grounds are all with rescued
Mhm.
animals. There's just a small amount. It's not a big large
Yes.
kind of a zoo, but it's like uh, alpacas and llamas and rescued dogs and
Mhm.
rescued chickens. But the land itself is very magical. You do feel like you're in Thailand
Mhm.
because there's bamboo all around. It's
Mhm.
inside the perimeter of Atlanta.
Mhm.
But there's 3 Airbnb cottages there, and then we offer yoga.
Mhm.
There as part of that. So you're with rescued animals on the ground. Rescued animals actually have a softness and an
Mhm.
empathy because they've known suffering and
Yes.
they've known pain. People being around animals, it kind of calms your nervous system down a little bit. We do body work. We do a workshop that's for 3 days, and it's life changing. We've had mothers and daughters that have come back more than once
Mhm.
coming to these
Mhm.
retreats. It just arms you with tools to build your own individual resilience recipe. And that's what this is about. It's about grief management. I'm not going to come to you and say that grief has to end by the time you're, a year into this or 3 years into
Yes.
this. Because honestly, I'm 50 now. My loss occurred 46 years
Yes.
ago. And, there's still times that it bubbles up for
Of
me. And, Mother's Days are pretty hard for me
Mhm.
still. And I mean, it's not like it wipes me out, but it
Same.
does, it's
Yeah.
tender. It's tender. So I think that if we look at grief care as grief management, it takes away that pressure that we
Yes.
have to get over it, that grief is an obstacle to overcome, because it's not really, because grief is essentially love,
Exactly.
and love never dies. Even if a body passes, love never
Never.
dies. And so grief honors that love,
You say so much, and I'm writing
and
so
it's
much,
important.
and I love what
I
you
know
say. It is truly grief management, and
it
it
is. It
it
is.
shouldn't have to start 3 years later or a year later.
I know.
I love what you said, that grief is love, which it truly is, because
whatever we're grieving, we felt like we once loved, or we love the idea of it, even if it was some things that maybe not losing someone or something, but that is all so true and so real. And let me tell you what's interesting. When I even read what you did in that, and that's the retreat, the one at that location where.
Yes.
So when my daughter and I was looking at a show on Netflix, but it's a lady who has a ranch that she has animals, where she had a son with that I forgot if it was a dog, I'm sure, that she got, and it helped him with the issues he's had. I don't want to say disabilities. I don't like to use that word unless she used it. I can't remember. And she said how much it helped him. So she started getting these animals that had some issues themselves, like as Figgy. They've been abused, or she had one young man. She has young people coming into her ranch now. Like one young man was blind, a young lady, she was blind, and she had a blind horse that she would take care of. So every animal, she now does not want to throw away any animal, because some of the animals have gone through abuse, and, and people are just probably, she said, putting the animals down. And she said, no, they're helping the kids.
Animals are amazing and very gift giving, especially those that have suffered and known pain.
Yes.
And Figgy and her gentle nature just softens people. And it's I love that it's an opportunity for people to come together with other grievers and just validate and say, you know what, I feel that too. Oh my goodness, I felt that too. And I was it's interesting, because unless we have that movement, unless we find people that are safe that we can talk about, all these emotions stay stuck. They stay stuck. That water doesn't flow through our souls. It doesn't move. And then that's when we start seeing maladaptive coping mechanisms that put you at risk for all the things that we worry about, for our high risk grievers, even divorce, relationships split up. Like if you're not able to process your grief, you carry that, it spills over into other areas of your life.
So let me ask you this. Have you felt like anything else in your life that has really took you aback with dealing with some of because you're so connected in what you're doing, and you're so intentional about everyone understanding this topic of around grief and trauma? Has there ever been anything that made you kind of question the whole journey of people going through grief, or a family or a child, or anything else besides that you've dealt with in your 20 years?
I don't know if it's made me question it. It's made me become more sensitive to a lot of the cliches that they're given to grievers. And I think, especially within the church framework, we're probably the most guilty of the cliches. And one of the ones that stick with me came a little boy that passed away from a terrible, well, all brain tumors in pediatrics are terrible, but this specific brain tumor, it really is the worst you could possibly have. And he had a 4-year-old sister who was a delight. And we attended her funeral, the funeral of the boy and the sister, and this was before COVID. And one of these well-meaning souls that we all probably know within our spiritual framework approached the little girl and said, your brother's in a better place right now. And there for a second, these cliches, they hit differently on grievers. Okay. They do. And when I heard the words come out, I'm like, how it's going to be unique to how this 4-year-old little girl reacts to it. And she looked up at her, she goes, no, the best place for my brother is here with me. And, it just makes you question things, like when you tell someone, oh, they're in a better place, and to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or even probably an 8-year-old, they're like, no, I don't understand that. The best place for my brother or my sister, the best place for my mother or my father, my grandmother or my grandfather is here with me. And so I think the things that I've learned, it's not so much that I've questioned, but I do wish as a society, we could be kinder with the things that we speak to grievers. Like when we tell people to be strong, or, keep busy, or, don't cry. We're essentially telling people don't express your emotions. And then we worry like why people aren't expressing their emotions. It's like, it's just utter confusion. And so I think if that's probably that still kind of sits with me. And so part of what we do whenever we're talking to families whether, before a child dies or after, is, just be gracious to
Yes.
people when they come and they say these things. They don't realize they're just trying to tell you things that make them feel better. They don't really know what to say. But it also gives them an opportunity to educate those that they love, to say, this is what we're thinking when you say that. And then when we have these conversations and we tell people, well, that's just not a helpful, cliche to say, then it slowly changes what people say to their neighbors, to their families. And that's how we change a
Yes.
culture, is when we talk about it. We acknowledge that. Don't just say be strong. And let's reframe what strength looks like. And, those are the things that I think would benefit grievers collectively around the world, really, is as if we could just be more, thoughtful of the words that we speak to people that are in trauma due to grief.
That makes so much sense, because I know I'm thankful I changed the way I've said it to people. I'm even careful of, just to say, sometimes even just saying, have my condolences, it seems like it's just words that we say. So my thing now, I try to change it and say, praying for peace. And if anything, and does that make sense, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, of course it does. I think whenever we are approaching a griever or someone that's had this trauma, and this is what I teach in classes on how to, care for those that are in grief and trauma. It's like, think of what you're saying, and is it going to land on a person? Are those words going to help them to expand and open up, or cause them to shut down? And that, if we could all kind of take that on, and that be meaning, like, instead of saying, your loved one is no longer suffering. So let's just think about that for a second. When you say your loved one is no longer suffering, then they're like, yeah, you're right. They're no longer suffering. So my emotions don't matter. I need to push them down. I need to stagnate them. I need to push them away and just ignore them. Or, stay busy. When you tell someone to stay busy, it's like, stay busy so that you don't feel. I mean, like, let that kind of sit there. Just keep busy. Even, especially, you hear this a lot with people that are going through divorce. I've got a great friend that's going through that right now. And she's like, Lanise, do you know how many people that have told me just to stay busy? And I'm like, and again, we have that conversation. When you're giving advice to someone that you love and you want that advice to be helpful, just think about, are these words going to expand them and make them want to open up and let these emotions flow? Or is it going to contract them, pushing those emotions down and causing potentially maladaptive coping mechanisms? And I think if we could just put that filter in our hearts before those words come out of our lips, we can start to change slowly what grief looks like in the context of personal relationships. And that's how we change a culture, is just talking about it, opening things up, and, thinking about how our words land. That's a big step.
That is a huge step. And if anybody, everything you've said, we're going to get something out of it. But if that is the one thing that we learned today, Path listeners, is watching what we say, to make sure we are not saying words that we're saying words that expand that person to be open and share, or and share their emotions instead of suppressing it. That is so huge. That is a way of helping on our little part that we can do if we're not close to the person, being careful with our words.
And that can be in grief. I mean, that can be like even a neighbor that's, had a boyfriend break up, like they had a boyfriend break up, or, a relationship fight, like if you know people that are in a little tiff. I mean, again, just allowing that to open up instead of pushing those emotions back deep down inside. It's just, especially now with COVID, we need to have much more expansion.
I agree. Let me ask you this. I know I'm trying to learn with sake of time. Everyone, I promise you, I am bringing her back. I'm going to beg Lanise to come back, and we're going to do a live show. I'm going to put it out here today. If you have questions, I want you to start sending those questions. And even if you don't send the questions, I will be intentional about making sure we announce it way in advance so you can come in and do a live show, and she can answer some questions for some people who may have questions I'm not thinking of, because I know I don't know it all. And she has so much information, wealth of information in her, and she can talk like she has there's so much I would love to talk about still, but I know we can't. So I want to ask you, so audience, that'll be coming soon, hopefully. Just stay tuned. Tell me some things that that you would like still to share regarding grief and trauma, regarding what
we would need to know that I may not have asked so far, that is important to the work of us just helping ourselves if we're not if we can't have a team like you. How do we learn to deal with this grief and trauma that you will?
So I, and I think, I don't know if we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. I think whenever it comes to working through our own emotional and, trauma and grief in the bereavement, is look at like your most significant loss in your life. Like, how old were you when that occurred? And what we do, like when we're doing an assessment on a family, or whenever I'm talking to a friend, or if I'm giving someone advice, like go to that first significant loss. And a lot of people have suffered losses in childhood. And if you can get that age group that where you were at, and really what I like to do is kind of bring people down to the developmental phase of where you were in life when that occurred. That gives you a lot of resources on the best ways to cope. It really does. Like for you, instance, like you lost your mom when you were 12, and that developmental phase is really a sense of belonging. And so when you were talking earlier about how you like to you're like a people pleaser. Yes. You want to make sure everybody's loved and taken care of and wrapped your arms around them. And that's kind of the developmental stage where that loss occurs. And sometimes people can kind of get in that loop of being kind of, I don't want to say stuck, but those are the patterns that you carry through your life, the rest of your life, that developmental age. And, I kid myself and my friends who know and love me, and they're like, Lanise, your 4-year-old is driving the bus right now, because whenever I'm in grief and trauma, my 4-year-old starts driving the bus, and that can be kind of messy. That can be kind of messy. If a 12-year-old is driving the bus, that's going to be kind of messy too. So we've got to go back to that and really start to see that inner child within each of us. And that can be through, there's therapists that really specialize in this. And there's just a lot of books and resources that are out there about healing your inner child. And I think that's crucial to start to do that. And then, when you are going through a really tough time, to just put yourself around safe people. Like really put a filtration system on your inner friends. Like, I think I've got a lot of like people that I know that I consider my friends, but my core group, it's like 2 or 3 girls. I mean, these people have gone through that filtration system with me to where whenever I'm in front of them, I can let my emotions just flow. Because if you're not around safe people to where your emotions can flow, all that stuff is going to get stagnated. If you don't have friends in your life that you can say, you know what, I'm really pissed off at God right now. Like, these are the kind of friends that you need to have in your life. You need to be able to say without any kind of judgment or shaming. So again, going back to that inner child and kind of feeling your way through, like what remnants are still present in the way that you interact with others. How do you deal with conflict? Do you let the 4-year-old drive the bus, the 12-year-old, the 9-year-old? And we start to work through that, and then just being around safe people. And again, there we go, the somatic and the cognitive body work. That's how you manage grief. That's how you enhance your life quality. And that's how we better each other and those that we love.
Yes. That's all wonderful. And let me tell you,
that was kind of a long.
You could keep going, because I wanted to give this floor to you to share some of this important information. That was not too long. It was. Okay. It's what was needed. And if you had more, I would love for you to go ahead and share it if you had anything else you wanted to add to it. Yeah. Because that's pretty the basics. I mean, that's the basic, the foundation. But I think going into having maybe a conversation about what grief looks like for children, there's only 4 developmental stages, and we could make a podcast on that too, if you want. And that way parents can, parents can get a little bit of input there too. Of course. Because when you have, like with your godson, he's 12, you're like, what in the world do you do for a 12-year-old? And I'll tell you, like for a 12-year-old, they do not want to feel abnormal. They do not. So they will suppress their emotions, because developmentally, they're like, I don't want to be any different than my friends. So the very best possible thing for a 12-year-old is a support group. And I've got resources I can share with you guys about that if you want to. This is online. So he can see other 12-year-olds that have gone through loss, and he'll start to let those emotions flow. Exactly. That is wonderful, because it's so interesting, because one of my prior guests, she was my first guest from the UK. She was saying how when she talks to some people, And she goes back to that first time they can remember something traumatic happening to them, because that's what she said. She takes them back to whatever that time was, and or what
Right.
let them tell her. So because she always said that's where your healing starts. That's where it is, right there. Because it builds, and that's why I love talking to people, because you learn so much and you hear it, which you can tell that is a true thing. Go back um, to those ages, that developmental age, or that age when something like that happens, because that is it's healing the inner child, and which is a wonderful thing
It
that
is.
I think we all need to. We really think as adults, especially, I'll go to the adults. Kids, I think we can learn so much from them, but as adults, we really think because we moved on, that everything is okay. But if we truly have never dealt with that and made some, allow that emotion to, like you say, express that emotion, share that emotion, we would definitely, it would come out in different ways. And I believe that's probably, I'm not judging the world, but the world where we see so much is happening, I believe that it's a reaction from something that a lot of people may have suppressed in some ways, some form of.
I wanted, you made a comment that, so I did a workshop in Rwanda, and for survivors of the Rwandan genocide. This happened 20 years ago. Okay. Actually, I think it's like 22 years ago. 22 years ago. And we are just now starting to see the remnants of unexpressed grief, because in that culture, you do not show weakness. And they think tears is weakness. They don't cry. And so now what we're finding in that area of the world is that we're having this eruption of child abuse, because parents that survived that, their anger, and anger is the most easily accessed emotion, because it doesn't make you feel vulnerable. It actually protects you. And so we're seeing this domestic abuse, we're seeing child abuse, we're seeing alcohol abuse, so much more in that little piece of our world. Because for 20 years, there was no resources for grief to allow these emotions to flow. These human beings did not have safe people, because these safe people were giving them cliches that did not expand them. It contracted them, push their emotions deeper inside. And those emotions have to go somewhere. They don't evaporate. They do not evaporate. They stay stuck deep, and they burrow and they bind all the way down to the bone marrow. And what happens is, when we see these eruptions of violence, when we see these eruptions of child abuse, and even this collective, here in Atlanta, we're seeing a lot of just crime and violent crime. And of course, people around us are looking at us and going, oh my gosh, what's going on in Atlanta? I was like, we're not arming the men and the women of our world with grief tools. All this grief is being suppressed, and it's got to erupt. And it's the same thing in Rwanda. So they're like, what's going on? Why are we here? Why is all this anger coming around? And I look back and like, what? And I asked the pastor that I was sitting across the table from, I'm like, well, what kind of things did you guys arm these broken hearts with for 20 years? When I asked him that, he looked at me, he goes, Lanise, you have just inflicted a lot of responsibility on me that we have not provided to the people of Rwanda. And of course, I'm not meaning the whole country. I didn't work with the whole country. I worked with, a group of people that were chosen because their grief, they were just having a lot of maladaptive coping mechanisms. And so I feel like that globally, that we need to take heed of that, kind of warning, those kind of situations where we're like, instead of blaming people for these anger outbursts and the crime, let's dig deeper in their souls. What have they bound and burrowed and pressed so far down that their bodies can't do anything else but react in anger? And
something I love you said, I love that you also said, when you don't allow them, anyone to get it out, having a safe, safe people around you, and you suppress it. And then we were telling everyone to, get over it, or be okay, you'll be okay or we just telling them, move on. That's why some people will suppress it. I went to, it was a panel of one of my other guests, she did, regarding abuse, people who have gone through different forms of abuse. And I remember it was a young lady on there, and she was a judge. And she said that even when she was molested by her uncle, that her grandmother just told her, wipe those tears, and you have work still to do. You have to keep moving. It's like, as a young person, they really made her feel like what she said wasn't valid. I said, I want to do shows on silent stories, the silent stories that people don't share, or our families have hushed or told us not to talk about it. But again, it all goes back to me, is my point, is having people suppress those emotions, or what happened, or the grief of being abused, and the pain of being abused, and the different things such as that. Even though you think as a grandmother that is the person you can talk to, it's still sometimes our families who love us, I know still it doesn't help.
With families, we have to
Yes.
give a lot of grace here, because this grandmother is given the advice that she was given from her grandmother, from her mother. So it is a generational patterns of behavior that are not necessarily helpful. But I want to be very kind and walk this very fine line here, because, and you probably, especially in the world that you minister in, there's this culture right now of this toxic cancel culture that we're seeing. Like, if someone diminishes you and your family, then you just completely break away from them. That is not, we have to be much more compassionate around people, because this grandmother or grandmothers that I've known, or people's parents that I've known, like when they say things that are not helpful or can be hurtful, it's not that they're trying to be hurtful. It's just that's their pattern that they've ever known, right? And because that can cause a lot more grief too. Like when you have families split up around words and verbiage. So it's just a sensitive time in our world, and it's important that we give each other so much grace, and just give each other places where we can expand and talk without judgment. And and if you feel angry about something, kind of get to the root of it. Like, really, what is the root of this anger? Of course.
And that makes sense, because that's one thing I thought about as well. Even just using that grandmother's story, I shared too with my daughter. I felt like, because just like you said, she was taught that, and it was that who you. It's just the patterns again. Or even how we say we deal with grief, if even if it's the loss of a loved one, it's a pattern that we're taught, and we pass it on to our kids and to the next person, and hopefully it stops with. Even though her relationship was I believe still great with her grandmother, but I think she understood that, and that's when it gets to a place where that one person where they stop it, which is a wonderful thing. And with her sharing her story and telling everything, I think that's sometimes where you stop that cycle, unfortunately, of how we grieve, how we deal with these different emotions and the things that's happened to us that's been bad. So that's the wonderful part, when people start to talk about all of these different forms of abuse and the different things that people are dealing with, which is wonderful. So let us go back in. I know for sake of time, tell me again about all you have going on. That's what's coming up in the coming months, and how we can connect with you.
Well, I would love to connect with you guys on social media. I'm just at Lanise Shortell. I do a lot of informal kind of education tools. Now, I will use, I will definitely use Instagram to like talk about certain conditions around grief, like broken heart syndrome, and what traumatic injury is, and allostatic, it's called operational allostatic overload. It's like when our bodies carry grief chronically without like release from it, like what it affects us. It increases our blood pressure. So I do a lot of little pictures, but I also have a lot of yoga stuff on or movement therapy. And you'll see Figgy on Figgy and Dalai Lama and all the alpacas and the llamas, where we do yoga, and we offer free grief workshops. Free grief classes to our community once a month for people that just need to learn more about it. And then we also have the deep dive of the weekends in Atlanta that are really popular. And again, that is a workshop, like a cognitive workshop. We talk about terms a lot like what we talked about here, but there's a progress of the workshop, and then we do body work. And we serve Ayurvedic based food, which is specifically designed for the needs of grieving bodies, like the nutritional needs of a grieving body. So that's where the nurse in me kind of gets really excited, because it is really whole body health.
So there are certain foods that you would even recommend.
Yeah, grounding foods, things of that nature. So my partner Leah, and she and I do the grief retreats together. she is this incredible, like Ayurvedic, like cook, and she is so grounded in how nutrition helps bodies. And then it's just an incredible weekend. But we've got a retreat coming up on February the 18th, 19th, and 20th, and we've got 2 spots left. They'll fill up pretty quick. But if you guys know anybody that that would benefit from it. And what's interesting is we have return guests. It's because it's just such a healing respite for a grieving soul. It's I love it because we get grievers together and they validate and they make friends, and people are like, oh my gosh, me too. You know,
that's a good Me Too movement. Exactly.
You know, there's a good,
of course. And let me tell you, that's what a part of the path is supposed to be about. It's the Me Too, the different topics that people go through, the different things that people share, letting them know you're not alone.
We have a dad that this is what is just is so sweet. So a dad just signed up to come to the retreat he's going through a divorce with both of his daughters, his adult daughters. So I mean, they're going through divorce and they're going to go through the grief retreat together with the lamas, and you know, doing the cognitive work and you know, the body work. And they're like, we want to arm you know, our family with how to get through this without having these coping mechanisms that can be acidic. You know, if we don't talk about things, if we don't get these emotions flowing, it's acidic. So it's just beautiful.
It's wonderful. He's doing it with his young adult daughters. So what you all are doing, that's a wonderful thing in the retreat. And everyone, please make sure you follow her, connect with her. But you didn't bring up that I know you said you've done work in Rwanda. You were just in Guatemala. You do a lot there. And so internationally, I know you said it in your bio, so you're all over. And that's a wonderful thing.
I am all over. So I do. I work. So I'm a part of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, if you guys aren't aware, she was like one of the founding grief workers in our world. She was a psychiatrist and really opened up conversations. She authored the book, The 5 Stages of Grief. Everybody knows that. Like she was the author of that. And so I am so lucky to work with some of the most amazing grief advocates around the world and connect with people really all over the globe in this capacity. And it's interesting, like in Rwanda, we have grievers that really stuff and they don't talk about it. They keep a stiff upper lip. In Lithuania, we've got the grievers that tend to, because alcohol is very common in the society. So we have a lot of people that go to alcohol as a soothing mechanism. So, you know, although grief is consistent, those emotions are consistent around the world, the way that we grieve them, the way that we express our emotions or we stuff them are different based on what part of the globe you reside on. And so it's interesting. But in reality, we're all just trying to get through the pain that is left in our heart, you know. So what works for someone in Lithuania may not work for someone in Rwanda or someone in Guatemala, for instance. And one of the things, I was in the Faroe Islands this last year, and they have a very high rate of suicide there. So that's just a different way of how people grieve. And, you know, people too, a lot globally will think that grief is like a sickness. It's not. Grief is normal. Like you said early on, it's normal. It's expected. We expect those emotions to flow. When those emotions don't flow, that's when we can get into some sickness. That's when we can really get into depression. But I do want to say, grief is not depression. Depression is not grief. Depression is suppression of emotion. This stuff way, way, way down. And if you do not have safe people, if you don't have ways to let those emotions flow through your body, depression can and often can be a result. So, I think just knowing that grief is not an illness is very important to kind of lay the foundation, ways that people can build their own resilience recipe that goes for cognitive therapy, that's talking to safe people. And then the somatic, that's body work, how we can work things through our body. And just knowing the maladaptive coping mechanisms. One of the moms that I talked to the other day, who followed up with a bereavement visit with her, she's like, Lanise, I'm just shopping with Amazon. Like that's all she's truly feels like she's got an addiction that's forming around it. And I'm like, well, what are you trying to hide when you go to Amazon? What is the emotion that you're trying to hide? Next time you step into that space, just ask yourself, what am I trying to numb out? What am I trying to hide? And that opened up a pathway for her emotions to move. She's like, I'm trying to avoid the despair that I feel over her son's death,
Natural.
which is completely natural, right? And whenever you buy something, you get that hit of dopamine. And so you feel better a little bit more. Well, no matter how many Amazon packages show up at her front door, that grief and despair from the loss of her son is still going to be there. So it really depends on, do you have safe people around you that you can start to work through this now? Or are you going to put it off 10 years when you've got debt upon debt that's starting to spill out into your life quality because we weren't afraid to really dig in those hard emotions?
Let me ask you this, because I'm going to ask again, and you probably said it. How do you calm Lanise again and just make sure you can refill and fill your cup up so you can keep pouring, from your keep pouring from your overflow, like they always say? How do you truly do it?
Because grief reminds us that that life is brief. Like what I said about the family from Thailand, when they welcome a baby into this world, they're like, welcome to life, your pathway to death. And so grief reminds us that death is the final expansion of our souls, right? For me, how do I fill my cup? So I do have an incredible community of people around me. I mean, like I said, I've got 2 or 3 people that are my gold standards. They're my gold standards, religiously being based. I mean, my spiritual framework has helped me it's been an anchor for me in many ways. Body movement. And then I even pulled in, we're in the work that we do, we are kind of, I don't want to say mandated, but we are required to have some sort of therapy ongoing with us. So we are constantly working on ourselves in a professional arena, because if we don't have a place where we can metabolize things, then those of us in this community, we would burn out, so that's been really important. And of course, like the body work. So that's kind of how I keep my ship afloat with the tools. The passion behind of it, I think my grandmother, who, it was my mother's mom, after the loss of her, my mother was her only child. She was never really quite, her world completely changed at the loss of her daughter and her only grandson. I mean, her life completely changed. And I found myself being frustrated with her because I felt like, growing up, looking at her, I didn't understand, first of all, because I'd never lost a child. But looking into that now and looking back, she didn't have a place to really go to talk. She didn't have safe people, because back in the dark ages, this happened in 1975, like people didn't talk about grief. It's like, you just got to trust God, move it through. Well, I saw her on the isolation side. I saw her suffering because she didn't have a lot of people to talk about it with. I saw her suffering because she ended up developing breast cancer, which now looking back, knowing epigenetics and the science of suppressed emotion and suppressed ability for your immune system really combat things, I often wonder if maybe that wasn't a correlation. I saw her have a tendency to get to access opioids to numb physical pain, when now, as someone that deals with grief, I'm thinking she was probably using those to numb her emotional pain. And then she finally died. She actually had the breast cancer had come back and had invaded her bones. And so she actually, and when I look back now on her and how her life was after the death of my mother, her life was very constricted because she didn't have many opportunities to expand. The world just wasn't available to her to express her grief. And she had even spent some time, she went into a residential program during some times when I was growing up, because she was, what they said, had a nervous breakdown, because of the loss. She just didn't have a place to put it. So, and this was my mom's mom. I think that looking back at me, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that, I only knew one mother that had to live through the darkness of grief without support. So what keeps me going and keeps me motivated? Her legacy. Like on my watch, I don't want anyone to have to ever feel like they are alone and that they are shamed or they're restricted and that they can't expand their emotions. And I don't want anyone to ever feel as abandoned as she did emotionally, because that was hard for her. I look back at that now, there were no resources. If, when she went to someone to talk about her emotions around grief and not being able to talk about them, for her to be, and there's times when a residential program is needed for people, and I'm not degrading that, but it was just natural grief that she didn't have a way to express. and it impacted her emotionally and it impacted her physically. It diminished her life quality. So what keeps me going is to just talk about this and expand the little corners of the pockets of the world that I'm in, so no one else has to feel that way.
Okay, I'm gonna have to take a deep breath because you're so honoring your grandmother with the work you're doing today. You are that person she needed, the team that you're working with. You are the person she needed at that point. And the world is so much better. And your grandmother, I know your grandmother is so happy.
Yeah.
And and everyone, let me tell you, I try to end the shows with the points. You've given all the points that we needed for the show. I Everyone, I will share all of Lanise's information that she talked about, her workshops, in the show notes. I will bring her back if she will come back, in the time she has. And we will try to do again a live show because I would love to. I can keep going on and on. I want to share a story of someone else and everything you said that your grandmother dealt with. I can say so much more and I still want to talk another hour with her. And I just know for sake of time, we're going to have to bring her back. And I want to ask the audience to think about everything she said and ask and find those questions that you may have that you still need answers to, and even send a message to us, and I'll see if we'll put them together and make sure when we do the live show that if she comes back, I have to still ask if that we can answer those questions, because everything she said that she knows her grandmother, she wished she had, we want you to have today. And and everything she's doing is making sure so everyone can have, to release and to get all of those emotions out, finding that safe place with people to deal with, and even discovering some and being a part of the cognitive and somatic therapies that are out there. It is important. And we know all forms of therapy is important. That is the goal of this podcast this year, is still bringing more people in, talking about all of the different things that they're doing to help all of us cope and deal better in life. And grief, again, is the one, like she said, that unites us. I'm going to end the show. Lanise, I'm going to put it on you. I want you to end the show. If there's anything, even if you just say until next time, or which is, you tell me what you want to say so we can end this show. And I want to say thank you again for being a part of me, talking to me and the past listeners. So the floor is yours.
I'm I'm very grateful. I can't tell you how much it just warms my heart to see you advocating for grievers. My heart is out to yours. I hope that you feel the love that I'm sending you. I think one of the things that is so important to grievers, and that means to each listener, because none of us are escaping this life without significant grief. Be kind to yourself. Find ways that you can expand, that you don't push yourself and your emotions back down deep within to your bone marrow. Find ways to be compassionate and giving to yourself, because when we're compassionate and giving to ourselves in grief and loss, we're able to be more compassionate and giving to others. And that's how we change a generation. That's how we support the next generation of grievers, so that no one has to feel alone and no one has to feel isolated, that we're recognizing that this is how we come together as a community, as a country, and as a world.
I couldn't have said it better. Again, thank you, Lanise. And we will be back until next time. And I feel the love, so trust me. Thank you. Until next time, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for hanging with us. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other platforms, so you can stay up on our bi-weekly real conversations with these bold women. You can follow the Path Podcast on Facebook at the Path Podcast, and on Instagram and Twitter at the Path_podcast.
And if you would like to be a guest on the show or have questions for a future show, you can email us at thepath4ward@gmail.com. That's thepathforward@gmail.com. And if you're looking for a speaker or you're in need of a life coach, please reach out to me. Again, at thepathforward@gmail.com or at ACKORLEH@gmail.com. Thank you. Until next time.